Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are AccessAble, and we're the UK's leading provider of detailed disabled access information. Today's session will focus on inclusive employment and the importance of accessible working environments. A few points for housekeeping. The session is being recorded. Audience members have their microphones muted, and panelists, please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. We will be using the chat function throughout the session, so if you have questions or comments throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll also have time for a short Q&A at the end. We're utilising automatic captioning on Teams today, so if you require captions, please press more or the three dots and go into settings to turn on automatic caption. My name is Carrie-Anne Knightley. I'm head of marketing at AccessAble, and I have cerebral palsy and I use a wheelchair. I am a white woman with curly blonde and brown hair. I'm wearing glasses with dark red frames and a blouse with pink and red and white spots. And now I'm going to ask our panelists to each introduce themselves using your name, a description of yourself, your lived experience related to the session and the work that you do. So Ross, we'll come to you to introduce yourself first, please.
I knew you were going to go with me first. Hiya. So I'm Ross Hovey. I am a white male, balding with a beard that needs a good trim. And I'm sat in a wheelchair because I have spinal muscular type 2, and I'm wearing a black jumper. So a bit of a clue there. My lived experience of being disabled and working full time since leaving university for 22 years means I have a really good understanding of what it's like to work somewhere and need adjustments. And whilst I'm not here representing my employer, I have for the last 10 years worked in the field of disability and accessibility, namely running my organisation's workplace adjustment offering, and more recent years supporting our accessibility agenda more broadly.
Thank you, Ross. Chloe, we'll come to you next, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe Tia. I have mild cerebral palsy and I'm also registered blind. For me, that means I walk using mobility aids and also have a newly qualified guide dog who probably will try and make an appearance at some time because he normally does. In terms of my role, I have worked for Scope, which is the disability charity, for just over 4 years now. And my current role is within content design. So I write their information and advice pages. I'm also a freelance writer and public speaker. And I feel like accessible employment is just really important, and actually I wouldn't be able to do my job if it wasn't for certain adjustments. In terms of my description, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair and dark glasses.
Thank you, Chloe. We will look forward to an appearance from your guide dog, Desi, as the session progresses. And Beth, we'll come to you last to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. So I'm Beth Willer. In terms of my description, I am a white British woman with curly brown hair and I'm wearing a dark red top and a pearl necklace. In terms of my lived experience, I was born with a moderate to severe hearing impairment in both ears, and I wear hearing aids and lip read. in terms of my profession, I have over 10 years of experience working within commercial strategy. I started my career at Deloitte as a management consultant before moving into the retail sector, where I'm now a manager. And I'm also the founder and co-chair of my company's disability network, AccessAble. And it's really good to be here today.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to all our panelists. It's great to have you with us today. So here is an overview of what we'll be covering in today's session. So during the webinar today, we will cover topics that will help you to learn about what inaccessibility looks like in employment, how working environments can be made more accessible, the role that reasonable adjustments play in this, accommodating employees with non-visible disabilities or impairments, and attracting disabled talent and the benefits that this brings. We will now begin the panel discussion, where you'll get insight into each individual panelist's lived experience. This will reflect the reality of their impairment or disability and is not intended to be comprehensive pan disability advice, but we hope that you will find it useful. So we're going to start off with some introductory questions around the importance of accessible working. So panelists, please raise your hand. Use the raise hand function in Teams when you're ready to answer a question. And the first question is, what assumptions do people make when it comes to your disability or condition? Chloe, we'll come to you first.
I think for me, a lot of the assumptions come from being registered blind. I get a lot of assumptions that like I won't be able to do certain roles or certain jobs, and actually I've never found it to be a barrier for employment, as long as I have the right assistive technology. But I think the assumptions are that like even as like broad as, well, how do you use a computer, or how do you get to an office and things like that. And I think it's like, I suppose that's why, you know, I like doing things like this to kind of dispel those myths and kind of make sure that people actually recognize and appreciate that, yes, there might be some limitations, but actually it's not necessarily the assumptions people make.
Thank you, Chloe. Beth, what comes to you next, please?
I think it's a really interesting question. For me personally, because I have a hidden disability, there's a whole range of different assumptions that people seem to make. When I first met my sister-in-law, actually, she thought that I had a speech impediment because I have a lisp, and that's partly because I can't hear high-pitched sounds, and S is a very high-pitched sound. So correspondingly, I can't say it myself because I can't hear it, and that's why I have a lisp. But if someone doesn't know I have a hearing impairment and they think I have a speech impediment, there's kind of almost this awkwardness of not really knowing what it is or how to approach it. On the other hand, I do have some people sort of say, well, I didn't even notice anything. And so it truly is kind of invisible. And then there's that has other pitfalls, because then there's almost an attitude possibly of, well, is there even a need for any reasonable adjustments? At worst, it could be sort of what's with the preferential treatment, if that's what they see it as, or even just completely sort of simply forgetting as we're working together that actually I'm working quite hard to lip read them and they don't necessarily notice that. But Chloe mentioned an interesting thing as well, which I think is relevant for hearing loss as well, which is that there are assumptions generated when we know that someone has a hearing loss. For example, that they might be slow to understand, that I might find it difficult working with lots of different stakeholders in a big meeting. Perhaps they think that perhaps I wouldn't be able to chair a meeting because of that. And actually, none of those things hold true. There are challenges, but certainly in my job as a management consultant, that was something that we did day in, day out. So very much around, I think Carrie-Anne will come on to this, but it's very much around having the right systems in place to be able to excel in my job.
Thank you, Beth. And Ross, we'll come to you last. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of like different sort of approaches in terms of my response to this one. So I think the word assumption is a really interesting one, and I guess the first thing is you can't expect everyone to be an expert on everyone's disability. So you have to acknowledge that people are going to make some assumptions, and again, without like being, I guess, like maybe being a bit modest, because I present myself quite well and have a kind of never say die do attitude. I think people therefore think that there isn't much that stops me in terms of my disability. So I think what a lot of people see, and I talk about this a lot, is the iceberg effect. So you only see the bit that I'm smiling, I'm at work and I'm trying to do my best. You don't see the bit around how I got there to work today and what I had to do to get up in the morning. So I think kind of to answer the question more specifically, I present as a wheelchair user, an electric wheelchair user. So people might think, oh, I'm paralysed when I'm not. I just have really weak muscles. And they may think that, well, he just needs a lift, he just needs a toilet and level access. But actually, my disability is more complex than that. And there are lots more things that I need. And there's a lot that goes behind getting me to get even up and work from home for the day or go into the office. And equally, once I leave the office, nobody has any understanding of like the journey home from work, maybe what that means to me from being in the office all day, how the rest of my day works. So I guess assumptions is one way. I think maybe just a more, there isn't enough understanding of the different types of disabilities and what impacts. People only see it at work, they don't see the bit before, the after, and all the kind of like hidden bits below the surface of the ocean.
Thank you, Ross. I think that's super interesting, and it makes me think about kind of the assumptions that I often face, and one of those is that because I am a wheelchair user, and as you say, presenting as a wheelchair user, people often just look at me and assume, okay, she's a wheelchair user, that's her impairment, that's what her needs are. And I have multiple hidden conditions as well as, my cerebral palsy, which presents very visibly. And so that is just to say that, yeah, as you say, there is often a kind of a tip of the iceberg type view there. So moving on to our next questions, and I think I want to ask these kind of both at the same time because I think they link together really. So if you can think about your answers to each of them. So realities of living and working with your disability or condition, and then what adjustments you need as an individual to perform your job effectively. Ross, you've raised your hand, so we'll come to you first.
So it's not a violin story because it's not about that, but I think the reality is it's hard, right? It's really tough working with a disability, and I think that's why some people with disabilities just see all the barriers and the difficulties and go, do you know what, this is just too much. So I think the reality for me is it's hard. I have to often think about in a working week, especially as I've got older. If people say, do you want to meet in the middle of the week after work? I'm kind of like, yeah, in order to be my best at work tomorrow, I'm not sure I can do that. So, kind of, I really live for the weekends. Trying to organise hospital appointments, medical equipment being serviced, car adaptations that go wrong, carers calling in sick, all those things distract me or have a knock-on effect on my ability to do my job. So I don't work traditionally the hours of 9 to 5. I'm often doing pockets of work in and around all of those other activities, so to kind of keep that level balance and keep on top of my work. In terms of then kind of and that's probably a really brief snapshot, and keen to make sure we all get the opportunity to talk about the experience. But I think I just spoke about the negative bit there about it's hard, but it's also like really rewarding, and actually I don't feel a burden on society. I feel that I'm putting back into the national stamp. I'm paying my taxes. I'm paying my national insurance. I'm contributing to society. So I'm not sucking the life out of the UK, even though I am very expensive to maintain. But I think also the other parts are the adjustments I need. So the biggest adjustment for me is a full-time support worker. So I have support from both the NHS and Access to Work to basically live 24/7, and without that, I can't go to work. That's as simple as that. That's the biggest adjustment for me. Other adjustments, I have a smartphone that's the one that's suited to me, not necessarily the standard one that we offer everybody at work, because it works for me, but it also blends between my home life and my work life. So not only can I answer my emails, but I can control the lights in my house and all those kind of things. If I do need to travel into work at different times or flexibly work, I have that support. If I need a hospital appointment or a medical appointment, again, time to take those are adjustments. So a lot of non-physical adjustments. I don't really have much physical one at the moment. I'm able to type quite well still, but I can imagine in the future I may be more reliant on dictation software, but I'm kind of very determined to not lose the ability to type. So until I cannot do it, I will continue to do it. But yeah, those are probably the key adjustments for me, and maybe some others that I've forgotten.
Thank you, Ross. I think what really resonated with me from your chat there was, thinking about that, how we organise our time to make sure we can work at our best, and that kind of, saying no to socialising during the week in the evenings, for example, is something that really carries through to my life as well, because I really need to protect rest time so that I can work at my best. Chloe, we'll come to you next, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I resonated a lot with what Ross said, especially like the iceberg effect, and there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. I suppose for me, a big part of like the reality of working with cerebral palsy is like the pain and fatigue that goes along with it. And actually, I am unable to work 5 days a week. I have tried for many years and tried different variations of that. So I tried working condensed hours. So I did 5 days worth of work in 4 days. I tried to kind of split up my hours differently. At the moment, I work 4 days a week and have Wednesdays as, I say, time off, but actually I suppose that is my recovery time that gets me through the week. And again, it's like it would be very nice if that could be a day of socializing and things like that, but actually it's resting, or it's simply doing housework that I'm unable to do after I've worked all day, and things like that, just kind of really managing fatigue. And actually, if I was to work 5 days a week, I wouldn't be my best self. So actually it's allowed me to give my employer the best of me by working less. And actually, I think I probably end up doing more because I'm not as fatigued as I would be if I was working 5 days a week. So yeah, I think as well, like I know Ross has said, it's the flexibility to not necessarily work traditional hours. If I've not slept well, I might start working a bit later, or if I've got an appointment, I might go out and do that, and things like that, where it's just there's a constant open dialogue with my employer, so they know when I'm working, and I suppose part of that is the trust that I'll get the work done, and I do. It just might not be within the core hours that you would expect. And, like I said, a big part of my adjustments is flexibly working, but also I use a screen reader due to my visual impairment, which reads everything out essentially that's on the screen. I also use dictation software and things like that, as well as like a specialist office chair to offer like support to my back and help to reduce pain and things like that. I think for me, a big adjustment as well is working from home. I have always worked from home, and actually, I think if I had to go into an office, it would probably mean I'd have to work less hours than I currently do. And I think, yes, people might not enjoy the commute to and from work, but actually that is so physically exhausting for me. It would really kind of have a knock-on effect for the rest of the evening, the rest of the week, and actually probably be unable to sustain long term for myself.
Thank you, Chloe. I spent most of the time that you were talking there vigorously nodding around the realities of working, particularly with cerebral palsy, because I mean, pretty much all of that resonates with me. And I think, you know, what I really liked about your answer there, that you can work a shorter week, but almost give more to your employer and be more productive. And I just think that it's so important that we recognize that not only as employers but as individuals, that it's okay to say, do you know what, I need to do less time because that's what works better for me, but actually I may be able to give you more output during that time. So yeah, just all really resonated with me. Beth, we'll come to you last. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left on this slide.
Thank you. I just want to say that quite a bit of what Chloe said resonated with me as well. So I'll kind of come on to where I thought there was a link. So with my hearing loss, it's estimated that I hear about 30% of average speech without my hearing aid. And then if I'm wearing my hearing aid, it comes up to about 50%. So a hearing aid is definitely not a silver bullet. And with all of the gaps, the things that I don't hear, most of that is, as I said, high-pitched sounds. And in the English language, or in language in general, that tends to be consonants. So C, B, D. And so that's why lip reading really helps me, because I can tell from lip movements and kind of almost piece things together like a jigsaw to work out what people are saying, which, as you can imagine, is a lot of extra effort going on in the background. To the point that people have made about the iceberg effect. It just couldn't be more true with kind of my kind of living and working life. So much of what I do to kind of get by is just kind of downright persistence, really, and masterful lip reading, having kind of taught myself from a very early age. But in terms of adjustments, it's probably three-pronged for me, which was firstly the technological side. So I not only have my hearing aids, but through Access to Work funding with my employer, I have what's called a Roger pen, which is like a microphone, and it essentially brings that person's voice straight into my ears, wherever they are in a room, and even if they step out of a room, I can still hear them. So you have to be a little bit careful of that. But it's incredible clarity and very helpful, particularly in board meetings where rooms are very, very big, and I have no chance of lip reading someone at the other end of the room. So they're quite key. The other bit is really, I would argue, just examples of good meeting best practice. So things like sharing an agenda in advance so that I can read up on the context of the meeting, which helps me fill in gaps. If there's any reading materials, having those shared. And then within the meeting, good facilitation. So a chair who, if someone asks something down the other end of the room, they will repeat the point back or repeat the question back so that everyone can hear, and follow up with minutes or key points and next steps. So really just good examples of, I would argue, good meeting etiquette. The third thing, which I think is probably the most invaluable, touches upon what Chloe just said, which is flexible working. So I do get tired from lip reading. So I try to leave gaps in between long meetings, and to work with the ebb and flow of my energy levels. And so that does tend to be, sometimes I'll start really early in the morning, like 7 o'clock, and then take a break earlier in the morning, later in the morning, just so that I don't get exhausted from lip reading throughout the day. Perhaps if I have an afternoon with no meetings, I'll use that to regroup, do some isolated work, perhaps work from home rather than being in the office, and that sort of thing. So that for me has been just really invaluable in terms of managing. And I think, just to the point that Chloe said as well, where it impacts me, because I work full time, I work 5 days a week, is if I'm doing additional training. So when I was at my previous employer, Deloitte, I did SEMA training, so my management accountancy training, and that just, whereas I think for someone without a disability, they might do that in their spare time. And that the courses are designed to be able to do that often. That's where I really have to think quite carefully about, actually, should I go down to 4 days a week temporarily? Because if I'm spending my weekends doing that, I've got much less energy to work during the week. So I think, as Chloe said, I've really had to kind of flex around those things, sometimes compressing my hours. At times I've taken a sabbatical or gone for short-term part-time arrangement to accommodate that.
Thank you, Beth. And I think really what I'm just struck by there is how much work and how much energy you have to use just to simply be able to communicate in your job, and how many strategies and tactics you have to do that are kind of unseen by everybody else. You've got this whole kind of energy drain going on, and it makes me think of that iceberg effect again. So yeah, just really important to bring that out. So moving on to our next slide. So we're going to focus here on how businesses and organisations can be more inclusive when employing disabled people. So I'm going to put all of these questions out sort of as one, and then feel free to bring in your answers, chip in to some of it, all of it, whatever you prefer. So we're looking at what inaccessibility looks like in employment, in your experience, and more broadly, how working environments can be made more accessible, and what the role of reasonable adjustments is. And we've had a question in the chat around access to work support for reasonable adjustments. So if anybody wants to cover off their experience of that, that would be welcomed. And then what tangible steps employers can take to attract disabled talent. So anybody want to jump in with thoughts on this one? Chloe, come to you first. Thank you.
Thank you. So I feel like I'm kind of touching on what I said on the previous slide, but I think one thing that kind of I missed out that can be classed as like inaccessibility is, I suppose, repeatedly ignoring people's reasonable adjustments. And if you're like repeatedly doing things that excludes disabled colleagues, like for example, I heavily rely on slides and documents and things like that being sent to me beforehand. Due to being a screen reader user, the kind of, when you share your screen or share slides in a meeting, I just cannot access them. And actually, it's, if people are repeatedly not sending out the slides, even when I've explained my needs and adjustments, I really do see that as inaccessibility. I think it's, it's something we all can learn more about, and it's something we can all improve on. But if someone has taken the time to kind of explain their needs and it's still not done, then I think that is very much creating an inaccessible work environment. And I think a lot of what that comes down to is, actually, as a disabled employee, I do a lot more work, in the background, just to ensure that actually my role is accessible to me, whether it's chasing up slides for meetings or, kind of having to send back PowerPoints with feedback to colleagues because they've sent me an inaccessible resource. And it's kind of having those conversations time and time again that can be exhausting. And, like I said, I think it's something we need to learn, and it's something that I'm more than happy to talk about and show people how to do. It's just when it continually happens by the same people, and actually it can be quite vulnerable to kind of share all your needs with someone and explain why you need a PowerPoint before a session. You know, you're handing over your medical information, which we shouldn't need to do as individuals, but that's often the case. And I think that kind of leads into like how we can make workplaces more accessible. And actually, do you need to know people's medical information to give them reasonable adjustments? Do we need to know exactly why they need that adjustment? And, you know, like, we shouldn't have to be providing medical reports or going into extreme details about our own condition. But I think part of reasonable adjustments is there needs to be flexibility within those adjustments, especially when it comes to like working patterns. You know, if an individual hasn't been in that role before, they might not know what adjustments they need. And actually, it's about working with the employer and with the employee to ensure that you both get the best out of each other. And actually, the disabled person is able to work to their best capability because of the adjustments. So like, for example, my condition might get worse during winter when it's cold, so I might need more adjustments during that time of the year. In terms of tangible steps, I think it's flexible working, I think, is key for a lot of disabled people. And I suppose being open to reasonable adjustments right from the get-go, not just in the role, but in the like application process, the interview process. There's all these things that adjustments can be a part of, and actually enable people and allow disabled people to confidently apply for a job because they know that they will be supported within that workplace.
Thank you, Chloe. Lots of really insightful thoughts. Ross, we'll come to you next.
Yeah, so I think, you know, really good stuff there from Chloe, and in the spirit of trying to, like, again, bring different views and different angles, and I don't want to try and repeat, but I apologise if I do maybe repeat some of this stuff. But if we start with the top bit around sort of inaccessibility, so, you know, kind of inaccessibility can either be through, you know, the physical environment, the non-physical environment, a process, a procedure. And whilst the world has still got a long way to go on the built environment that's used as an example, it's a lot better than it was 10 years ago. And, you know, I'm lucky to work in a large corporate. I'm lucky to have visited places like Beth's offices and other large corporates. And, you know, they've got automatic doors, they've got wide turnstiles, they've got low reception desks, they've got hearing induction loops, toilets, and still far from perfect. But I think what Chloe touched on in a bit, honestly, most of the inaccessibility, I think, comes from people, and whether it's attitudes or just lack of understanding, and just sometimes just not thinking. So, you know, I'm always one for a bit of comedy. You know, one of the biggest inaccessible things when I'm in the office is that somebody wants to use the accessible loo to have a rant at their partner or ring up their bank or something like that. And I'm desperate, and that's the only toilet I can use. And then they come out and apologise, and you're like, well, you wouldn't be apologising if you'd done anything wrong, if you hadn't done anything wrong. So why are you apologising? So I think, like, attitudes or things like, you know, we now work in this hybrid Teams world, and, you know, occasionally I leave like 10 minutes or 15 minutes between a call, and somebody goes, oh, there's 15 minutes there, I'm going to whack a call in. And I'm like, whoever it is at the other end, when do you think I'm going to go for a pee today? It doesn't take me 2 seconds. It's going to take me a little bit longer than somebody else. So there might be a reason why that gap's in there. So I think, you know, kind of like, you know, and they're just two examples, but I think a lot of it is attitudinal from people or lack of awareness. So I think like the working environment. So obviously we can improve the physical environment. So again, something I'm really passionate about, and I can see that somebody on the list of attendees is very passionate about this subject as well, is changing places toilets. We need every employer to stick one of these in for people that have more complex disabilities. That would be something that would really raise in terms of physical adjustments. But we need to also think more broadly about different types of non-visible disabilities. So our neurodiverse colleagues, how do we make the work environment more accessible for them? What about people with other sensitivities and other triggers? We need to think about intersectionality. So, we often have multi-faith rooms, but can a multi-faith room be used by somebody who is of a non-Christian faith to go and practice their religion in a wheelchair? Do we create accessible multi-faith rooms? Those are things that we need to really take to the next level. In terms of the bottom one, and I am going to do the access to work one, and then I'm definitely going to give Beth a chance to come on board. But so the tangible. So again, Chloe gave some really good examples. One of my visions, I guess, if I could leave this world in whenever that time is for disabled people, we often stay longer in full-time education because it's a safe place, and the world of work is more scary. And also because we maybe feel that we've got our own barriers, we want to give ourselves as much opportunity and as much qualifications to get the job that we need or want. And I think I remember when I left uni and came to work, it was a huge step. And it would be great if there was more sort of like accessible, and I know there is the 10,000 able interns, but not just an internship, start actually working with disabled people at level leaving age, get them into your organisation to do some work experience, help them get through university, maybe in the city that they, maybe encourage them to go to a university in the city where you've got a major employment hub, so that then you can almost start helping them build that full-time life ready so that the transition to work is far easier. So that more holistic view would be really good. And then in terms of access to work, so access to work is known as the Department of Work and Pensions best kept secrets. It's a really cool scheme. I think now it's just under £70,000 a year that an individual can get as a grant to create adjustments for them. And again, I've missed the middle bit about reasonable adjustments, so I'm just going to go back slightly. Reasonable adjustments are designed to level the playing field, not to give you what you want. Like, it's what you need. And I think there's a misconception sometimes people want rather than what they need, but it's to level the playing field and remove the barriers that disabled people face. In large organisations where, like Beth and myself work, they have more financial resources. So things like a chair, a desk, a laptop, some software, it might be within their gift. For smaller organisations, access to work can actually help purchase that equipment. And even in large corporate organisations where the reasonableness might go beyond what's reasonable for an employer to consider. So, for example, a full-time interpreter or a full-time support worker or support with travel to and from work. Access to work, again, is a grant-based system that can help you get that. And access to work, though, is not a benefit. That's another key really thing to remember. And it's not guaranteed. There isn't really a hard and fast rule of what they will and won't support. It's based on individual barriers, on the type of organisation you work for, and the kind of adjustments you need. And again, I think we could probably do a whole session on that, so I'll definitely stop there.
Thank you, Ross. Loads of great insight there. And Beth, we'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. So yeah, I'm going to try and touch on a few things. I think Ross and Chloe have been really thorough with their answers. But for me, I think personally speaking, inaccessibility in the workplace for me is kind of almost three-pronged, as Ross said. So it's that digital inaccessibility would typically most frequently look like videos being shared with no subtitles, because I rely really heavily on subtitles. And if they don't have that, then I would rely on a transcript, usually, or someone having made minutes or a summary of notes that I can read. It's particularly the case if there are lots of people who have an accent, because I struggle more with accents. Sometimes it's okay, but typically a video that's maybe got some background music or something like that, I'm really going to struggle with. Technology and buildings would be things like poor acoustics in large rooms. So often I go into buildings where there's not very good lighting, so I can't lip read very well. It's slightly echoey, and obviously now that we're using a lot of video conferencing facilities, that can be particularly exacerbated in that environment. So perhaps someone's remote and you're dialing them in and they're on speaker, and it's not very good acoustically and they're echoing. I can't really hear anything. I would struggle with that. So often I'll have to get my laptop out and maybe put the subtitles on, or the closed captioning on, so that I can hear them. But that can be really quite tricky. But I think all of it is very much, for me, as Ross said, driven by the attitude and having a level of awareness among people and an attitude to want to do the right thing and to improve things where we can. So rather than looking at what we can't do, looking at what actually improvements we can do, or what has worked in the past that we can learn from and take from perhaps another area where they've been doing it well, where can we apply that or roll it out. So it could be as simple as things like people just not being aware, and so they're talking with their back to me, maybe writing on a whiteboard, and they're not looking at me while they're writing. So actually, I need them to write something down and then turn around and talk, not try to do both at once. I'd need someone to be aware so they can repeat things, and perhaps if I'm going into a boardroom meeting, people to be aware so that they position themselves in the right place that I can hear and lip read. So perhaps maybe we've got 3 people going into a very, very large meeting room, that we all sit quite close together so that I can communicate effectively. So for me, a lot of it builds into that real awareness piece. I think in terms of what working environments how they can be made more accessible, a really big point for me, which I don't think anyone touched upon, was about disability networks. So at my organisation, that's one of the things that we have done, is we have set up a disability network, which is almost a voice for the lived experience. We have quite a few people with many different disabilities who can feed into the business and help to build that awareness, and just be a safe space where people can ask about things and start to understand better. But equally, we're almost an internal consultancy. So where the business is looking at improving business processes, policies, technology, we can feed into that to say, will it work, and to help them land it right first time. But that's why I really feel like the network is invaluable, because accessibility is a moving feat. It's not an end game. We've got to continue to learn, and that's where that voice and having that port of input is so invaluable, I think. The only other thing I would say about reasonable adjustments is that yes, they are invaluable to overcoming issues of access. So I talked about my reasonable adjustment of my microphone, but they really are just a guide. And really, I think, as I said before, it needs to have that right attitude, to put them in place proactively, but also to have that ongoing dialogue, as Chloe mentioned earlier, for maintaining those things. In terms of tangible steps, I think Chloe touched on a really important point about inclusive recruitment and doing it before the person's in their role. One thing that I've really loved recently is where we ask people what reasonable adjustments might support them at interview. I think you often find that even if someone has a disability, they won't actually say exactly what they need, because they'll be worried that it will put the employer off. But I loved it when our organisation actually said, well, here are some examples of things that we have provided people with before. And it was things like extra time within the interview, sharing the questions in advance, perhaps extra time for a numerical test. And it was just, as soon as you kind of had that list, you thought, oh, what a relief. Like, I can actually be honest. Okay, I will ask for what I need. And then, it's almost opens that dialogue. So that was one thing that I really think was be quite attractive, quite effective in attracting disabled talent.
Incredible, thank you, Beth. I really, like, again, vigorously nodded along at the end there, because I think the thing about reasonable adjustments is that often you don't know what you need until you're in the situation, and sometimes hindsight can be really helpful. And so, yeah, having examples of what could be provided is super helpful. And I think also to bring everybody's points together, you know, having flexibility of reasonable adjustment. So for me, what's been super helpful is for me to be able to say, okay, I need to try working in this way. Can I try that for a couple of weeks and we can see what happens, and we can maybe kind of tweak it and change it as we go along, because often you don't know until you try. So I think a flexible attitude is really key. Beth, I am just going to move on to our next slide just because of timing, but if you want to pick up on the next one, that's great. So this slide, we're focusing on meeting the needs of as many people as possible and nuances that employers should be aware of when it comes to disability. So common stereotypes or misconceptions around disability that employers should try to avoid. Obviously, we covered some of this in the introduction, but if there is anything more broadly that you want to bring out, please let us know. How to accommodate disabled employees in a way that goes above and beyond compliance. So Beth, in your last point, you were talking about the fact that it is a journey. It's never a box ticked and done type scenario. And then one thing that an employer could do for you personally that would make the biggest difference. Beth, we'll come to you first.
There we go. I thought I'd raise my hand because it sort of comes off the back of one of the things we were just saying, which is that I think one of the common misconceptions is that a person with a disability knows the adjustments that they need, and so they should be the ones that should speak up first to ask for them. I think off the back of that as well, I think there's a point around as the assumption that once you put reasonable adjustments in place, that should be it, and that if they've asked for what they need and they didn't say it at the start, then they should have asked for it, and the ship sailed now. It's finished. We can't help you. And I have had experience with that sadly before. So say for example, I was allocated a quiet room at one of my employers so that I could basically have meetings in a quieter space because the office was quite open planned, it was very noisy. But upon having the quieter room, I realised that I needed a computer, a TV screen, so that people could present presentations and talk to them without looking down into their laptops. So it would help facilitate me lip reading. It would help people to project up visuals of what they were discussing, etc. But they sort of said, well, look, we've given you the quieter room now, and now you're saying you need a TV screen as well, but you didn't ask for that at the start. That's a whole separate process, and there was a lot of resistance to it. And eventually it was signed off, but it was quite hard because you're not always going to know at the start exactly what you need, to Carrie's point. And it is that voyage of discovery, I think, on both sides, with the line manager, but with the employee as well. So I would say it's actually about line managers and leaders just continuing to be thoughtful and tuned in and listening to understand what adjustments might be needed as you go along the road, and indeed if that employee moves role as well, reviewing the systems that are in place for them to check that they're still going to be viable. I think the other one I'd just touch on is that often people they assume that they're worried about saying anything in case they offend someone because they don't know much about their disability, and so they decide it's better not to say anything at all, or they assume it's better not to say anything at all. And the point I would make about that is really that I think clarity and openness is the absolute foundation for a good relationship with any employee and their line manager, and that has to start at the start. And so just the simplest question of how are you, or how can I best support you to be your best in your role, is a brilliant opener to that. We have provided crib sheets to line managers on just the simplest questions to ask, because I completely empathise that a lot of access to work guidance and processes are really complicated, and line managers are people who are very short of time. So really simplifying things and making it easy to talk, I think, is absolutely key. I think on the one thing that an employer could do that would make it the biggest difference to me, I would say really building that awareness with line managers about reasonable adjustments, about access to work, just in simple ways, and signposting them so that they've got the resources as and when they need them, I think is absolutely key. And I'd just like to see more of that. I don't think it shouldn't be a line manager lottery in any business, big or small. So I'd really like to see that awareness being built up.
Thank you, Beth. Again, so insightful. And I think, yeah, it is about openness, kindness, thoughtfulness, and understanding at the bottom line of a lot of it. So Ross and Chloe, I can give you about 5 minutes each on this slide. So Ross, will come to you now.
Yeah, so again, loads of great stuff shared there by Beth. So much good takeaways. I think again, one of the kind of if we look at like misconceptions and stereotypes, so I think one of the biggest ones is that adjustments are going to cost a load of money, and that is, if you actually average it out over the number of employees you've got over the lifetime of how long the adjustment's going to last, most adjustments are a couple of £100. Yes, there might be some big adjustments with some colleagues who've got more complex needs, but again, if you take that across all of your employees, the actual cost per head is not a lot of money at all. So I think workplaces don't have to be expensive either. Something can be free because it's just a way of doing something differently, or it could be just a simple different type of mouse, which isn't that much than a normal mouse. I think the other one is as well that assuming that disabled people are going to have a lot of time off work, and again, I think Chloe and Beth and myself have kind of almost advocated this, that, and yourself, Carrie and Lucy, like it's almost like we're the opposite. We don't want to have a day off because we don't want to be seen as that disabled person that's always got a hospital appointment or a medical challenge. So we actually tend to be there more reliably, because also like things like access to work, you have to be at work to claim your access to work. So there's so many dependencies of us not being at work. If we're employing a support worker, we're responsible for their wages as well, because without us being at work, they don't have a job. So I think, disabled people on the whole are less, I guess, sickly than other non-disabled people. In terms of then accommodating disabled employees above and beyond compliance, I think that's the biggest error. If you're starting with compliance in mind, you're already failing. Employers need to start building inclusive design into the DNA of everything they do, not just the building, everything they do, from something for the customer that they're serving, from the people that work with them, just having disability as part of that project or change plan in mind. So what do we need to consider? What is the impact of this on our disabled staff? And if we can do that, then I think we'll create much more inclusive workplaces and be able to get more disabled people into employment. And the one thing that employers could do that would make the biggest difference, I've already touched on it, I'm going to plug it again, changing places toilets is a huge thing. But I also think the biggest thing that they can do, and again, I'm not here representing my organisation, but we do a lot of good things, and it's thinking outside of the box. So for example, we've recently just changed one of our policies whereby we can use 5 of our bank holidays on different days of the year, not necessarily the bank holiday. And that actually is working for me right at this moment. So I'm going on holiday next week. So by taking today as annual leave, I've now got a 4-day clear run before I go on holiday, rather than typing emails on the way to work. Now, that's not just great for me, that's great for everybody. But for a disabled person, that kind of adjustment may be really cool, even though it's a standard process. So I think, again, the biggest difference is just making flexible working, making it work, and understanding that disabled people work in different ways but will achieve the same goals if they're given the opportunity to.
Thank you, Ross. I think, yeah, we're all saying this over and over, aren't we? Flexibility and flexibility of attitude and the actual reality of flexible working, being flexible is such a key point. Chloe, we can give you sort of 2-3 minutes here if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. I will try and be quick. In terms of common stereotypes, I think for me it's about, just because one thing worked for one person with cerebral palsy doesn't necessarily mean that's the adjustments I need. Yes, there might be like quite a big crossover, but don't make assumptions based on someone's impairment in terms of what they should be doing. And actually it needs to be more of a kind of individualized conversation. And I do agree with what Ross said in terms of like probably less likely to take a day off, but actually it's important that we're not made to feel guilty when we do. Like, we shouldn't have to push ourselves to burnout to prove that we're worthy of employment, because actually that does more harm in the long run. And having that conversation with employers, and actually if you have 2 days off 1 week, that could stop you from having like 4 weeks off if you just completely burn yourself out. So I think that's something to be mindful of. And I suppose just acknowledging that we do have a lot going on, but actually we are capable of the job, and I think that's up to us to make that decision whether we can do the role, rather than that decision being taken away from us. In terms of like compliance, I completely agree with Ross that if we're starting with that, we're failing. And actually, why should we be doing the bare minimum? If you want the best out of your employees, you do the best for them, whether they're disabled or not. And I think that's, by doing the bare minimum, it kind of shows that you don't value the talent of disabled people. And actually, I think we should do that, because we are hardworking individuals who are natural problem solvers from living in a world that's not designed for us.
Thank you, Chloe. I really appreciate you sort of raising the point about burnout there, because it's one of the queries that we've had through the chat. So Leo has asked, what's the burnout rate on the flip side of that point about avoiding days off? And that was kind of what you'd mentioned earlier, Ross, that in general disabled people actually have less time off sick than non-disabled people, because of, I suppose, partly internalized ableism, partly worrying about the ableism of our employers. So I'm not going to put this through as a question, because I think we don't have data for that ultimately, but I think we can all say that I certainly have experienced burnout and was very lucky to be very supported very well by my employer to recover from that. And I do think it's an important thing that we need to sort of keep an eye on as people employing disabled people. Chloe, quick point here.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that feeds into flexible working. Like, if I worked 5 days a week, I would become burnt out very, very quickly. And that for me is unsustainable. So actually, I needed to figure out a way that I could sustain working without burnout. And for me, that meant working less hours.
Thank you, Chloe. We're going to move on to our final slide before we get to Q&A. And this is about the fact that everybody's experience is unique and that hiring disabled people can offer real benefits to employers. So points that we're covering here: what factors should be considered to accommodate employees with non-visible disabilities or impairments? So Beth, I'm feeling that you're going to have some points to bring out here, or maybe just want to underline some previous points that you've made. I appreciate we're coming towards the end now and we may be getting to a repetition point. How should intersectionality be considered an approach? So Ross, you had some really good points earlier about multi-faith rooms, etc. And then from each of you, I'd really like to hear how your lived experience or lived expertise of disability benefits you in your role and benefits your employer. Beth, we'll come to you first. Thank you.
I think it's a great question because often we forget about non-visible disabilities, and perhaps that's not surprising, but actually the majority of disabilities are hidden, and actually it presents different scenarios actually, because I think for some people they might well not even know that they have a disability, or they might not consider themselves to have a disability. So I know that's certainly the case with hearing loss. My more older relatives who have acquired a hearing loss in later life certainly haven't necessarily considered themselves to have a disability per se. So actually a lot of people would discover that they have a disability during the course of their working life, and I think that's really something to consider, because they might not be quite as forthcoming in terms of asking for things that they may need or find useful, and equally they might not want other people to know about it. So I think it's ultimately it can be quite challenging. For me, I think a really good thing to work on is building an understanding of the different perspectives out there, because as Chloe said, no one is the same and no person has the same requirements. So things like listening groups with colleagues with disabilities, or employee opinion surveys, or even tapping into, if you have one, a disability network, to understand where the best or the most support could be required, I think is really invaluable, particularly where disabilities are not visible. In terms of a question about intersectionality, I think, again, it just comes back to that point about, I believe that it's all about individuality and asking questions and really seeking to understand each individual's perspective and how they wish to have support. As someone with a woman with a hearing loss, I personally find it really difficult going into a boardroom full of men, explaining that I need them to all sit in a particular place so that I can live with them. It's really daunting. But equally, I don't think that most people would ever share with you that that is a really daunting scenario. So I think to that point, it's about openness and just about seeking to understand, asking the right questions, and how can you best support them and keep the conversation going. Lastly, I think on how does my lived experience benefit my employer, I think it's probably three-pronged, which is just my persistence and tenacity to succeed, to overcome all of the gaps in everything that I can hear, is just, I think, invaluable to my employer and shows what's possible for someone with a disability with the right support. I think secondly, my leadership of others, so just being a role model to them and coaching them, and being a confidant and bringing other people with a disability along behind me, and really speaking out for disabled talent. And then thirdly, as I said, an advisory role to the wider business. So speaking in as a voice of reason and a voice of the lived experience of someone with a disability, so that we land all of our initiatives right first time.
Thank you, Beth. Chloe, we'll come to you now.
Thank you. So yes, there are some conditions and impairments that are more inherently invisible, but actually there are very few disabilities that are completely visible. Even like sat on this call today, you wouldn't necessarily think that any of us were disabled. You would, if I wouldn't have told you, you wouldn't have known that I have cerebral palsy or I'm registered blind, because I'm sat down and you know, kind of you see a very limited view of that. And I think that's something that potentially has like grown with like a rise in working from home and Teams calls and things like that. You know, I don't think you ever see the full picture like we've mentioned previously, but I think it's when we're considering like accommodations, it needs to be the same across the board, because no disability is fully visible in that respect. And in terms of intersectionality, I think to say I liked Beth's point is probably the wrong way of putting it. But yeah, as a woman, it can be daunting to speak up and kind of ask for the support I need. But I think intersectionality is also about like socioeconomic backgrounds, or, you know, that it covers so much, and actually every individual has intersectionality. And I think that each view and each opinion is so valuable, and actually what makes the disabled community different from other minority groups, because we encompass absolutely everyone. And as bad as it sounds, everyone's probably going to join at some point. And actually, people don't think of that. Like, you could become disabled overnight. And I don't say that as a way to fear, I say that as a way to, like, just think of what you would want in that situation, and kind of accommodate the human being rather than the disability, because everyone's needs are different anyway. In terms of what I offer my employer, I write about disability for a living, predominantly the benefit system and social care and EHCPs. So the fact to have lived experience of that extremely benefits the end users, because it's written by someone who has been through that. But also I think it's invaluable inside knowledge that I can teach my colleagues about accessibility. And although it shouldn't be on the individual to do all of that work, by having disabled colleagues in your organization, you become a more accessible organization for everyone, because by becoming accessible to disabled people, you actually become more accessible to everyone. So I think it's only a positive to have disabled colleagues.
Thank you, Chloe. Ross, we'll come to you next, and then following this, we're going to move on to Q&A. Thank you.
So yeah, in terms of like the hidden disabilities and kind of, I guess, you know, some practical things. So like, you know, the sunflower lanyard is a really good tool for people to wear, just to kind of highlight the fact that they have an invisible disability that might encourage some conversation. I get though that kind of for some people means calling out that they've got, they're almost having to share that by wearing it, but that can sometimes help. One of the biggest tools, I think, and Beth touched on this in terms of her organisation giving some like word patterns or like conversation starters. So you know, a workplace adjustment passport, like, or a kind of workplace like adjustment sort of report or tool, or a document that basically enables a line manager and their colleague to kind of have a chat about them as an individual, and just, you know, don't assume that because you can't see it that there isn't something there. So again, in the organisation I work in, when we have our sort of quarterly appraisals, you know, the first question is like, how are you? And then there's like a sub question which is like, no, how are you really? And that is a really good opportunity for then, you know, the individual to kind of share anything they may not have shared before. And as Chloe touched on, you know, a year ago your colleague may have not had a disability and they may have acquired something non-visible. And then I kind of like leading that into the next section, you know, kind of intersectionality. So like, you know, for genetically female, and I'm trying to get this right, this says, but like, not only might they might have a disability, but at some point during their working career they might go through the menopause, and then they might have even more barriers during that period of that time. And that's just an example of where multiple disabilities, like, you know, the gender element can bring in additional things. I've already touched on the multi-faith rooms, people that identify as different, different genders might want to use a different accessible loo, and where are your accessible toilets? Are they in the male assigned? Are they in the female? Are they gender free? There's all these things to really consider, and it's difficult to get it right. I think that's the other thing. Employers need to be on a journey and not try to pretend that they won't make the odd mistake and that they're going to take time. And it's really hard to please all of the people all of the time, and that sometimes there's going to have to be compromises to kind of fulfill the needs of everybody. And I think the final bit, again, because we're really keen to get onto the question and answers and not kind of repeat too much I've already said. I used to find this question really difficult, and I still sometimes do find this difficult to answer. So as someone who clearly identifies as disabled, it often feels a bit of a cliche doing a role where you're working in disability. And then you have this thing that's like, people talk about imposter syndrome as well. So like, how qualified or how experienced I am to talk about it. And, I'm still not nearer 50 than I am 40, which is great. But 44 years of living on this planet, not just at work, just practical life experience of disability I bring. I think the difference and the bit I'm maybe commenting on at work is I'm not in the activist space. I'm more of a pragmatist, so I try and think about everybody. One of my real close stakeholders says, what I like about you, Ross, is that you represent disability, but your understanding of other people's characteristics, whether that's religion, sexuality, gender, is that you kind of come along with these different ideas and you're not just one dimensional. So yeah, I bring that lived experience and I bring that sense of humour to reality of situations as well, and that's probably where I'll finish.
Thank you, Ross. I would agree with that, and I would agree with what your colleague said. I think you do bring a really rounded perspective to your work, which is appreciated by all of us. So we're going to move on to Q&A, and we've had a couple of questions first of all that I would like to bring out from the chat, and then we will ask any audience members to raise hands if they want to ask a question so that we can unmute. We have just over 15 minutes for Q&A. So we've had a couple of questions in the chat from Leo that I think I'd like to bring out. So the first one, and it was arising from your earlier point, Ross, around importance of that transition from kind of university to working life, importance of getting that right. So what additional steps should employers take to counter the lack of paid experience some disabled graduates can have on leaving university?
Is that to me specifically?
If you're happy to answer it, then yeah, it is to you specifically. Thanks.
I think, when you're, and if we're talking about graduates or like, whether it's graduate intakes or general job applications, and a lot of this is like competency-based interviews or competency-based questions, it's just make sure you say, you call it out that opportunity to answer that question doesn't necessarily have to be because of like in a work capacity. So, for example, I actually had a mock interview last week at work, and the question was asked about like how have you adjusted your way of working to accommodate other people. And I actually said I'm not going to use a work example. I'm going to use an example from how I support my carers, stroke support workers, PAs, whatever we want to call them, whatever hat they're wearing. So, and I gained that experience through life, not through necessarily a paid job. So I'm an employer by proxy because of the way the system in the UK works. So therefore, I've got lots of gained experience through that. So I think, yeah, that's one of the things, is to make sure that questions are worded in a way that people can bring other lived examples. They might have had to negotiate a conversation with somebody around their care. They might have had to book travel for a group of people and include their own needs. So I think there's very different ways that people could answer questions like that.
Thank you, Ross. I think that's a really important point, and it goes back to something Chloe said earlier, which is, we are as disabled people, we are often natural problem solvers, because sometimes we have to problem solve just to get out of bed in the morning, and that's just a natural part of our day. And so I think, yeah, I just wanted to underline that point really and say, we have lots of transferable skills from our lives outside of work as well as inside of work. So one more question from the chat and then we'll ask for audience to raise hands. So what human factors would the panel ask people to think about when it comes to disability apart from intersectionality? I'm just going to ask for one person at this point to answer this. So anybody happy to jump in? Let me know if you'd like me to repeat the question.
I don't necessarily about repeating the question. I'm struggling to kind of get the question, if I'm being honest. Maybe if
so I suppose, you know, we've talked about the importance of intersectionality and the fact that, you know, for example, I'm not just a disabled person, I'm a disabled woman, etc. I suppose, is there anything outside of characteristics that that should be considered? Ross?
families. So many disabled people have families. There might be parents. So, you know, it takes them longer to do the school run than a non-disabled person maybe. They might be carers of. So although I can't physically care for my parents, they are in their 70s and I have to do lots of things like help them with their technology. I often have them around for dinner because they still do a lot of involuntary things for me. So I think it's just that understanding that, again, there's more than the disability, the intersectionality. They're living life. Again, a personal one for me, just to throw it out there, because you'll know what's coming. I love football. It's my hobby. It makes me happy. And sometimes that means that I want to flex my life a little bit around following my hobby.
Thank you, Ross. Chloe?
I think, like, just to say we're human, and actually, like, around choice and what do we want, like that's just as important as what kind of potential limitations we have because of our disability. You know, like Ross said, that one might be going to a football game, it might be doing the things that everyone else does, and I think that is equally as important to consider.
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, that is such an important point. We are just people. We are just people too, and there are often things that we want as well as things that we need. So, like, it's really important for me in my lunch break every day to be able to get outside and walk my dog, because I work from home, and if I don't have that opportunity, I can often not be going outside at all day, and getting that headspace is just really important for me as a person. I'm going to now ask our audience, anybody who would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function, and then we'll then activate your microphone so you can unmute. Karina, I have allowed your microphone, so you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I thought if no one else is going, why not? First of all, thank you so much for the insights today. It's been really insightful. I work at the London Stock Exchange Group as a D&I manager, and disability is definitely something that we are very much focused on strategically through disclosure campaigns, as well as looking at our reasonable adjustment processes. So thank you so much. Something that comes up quite a lot, and I mentioned it in the chat earlier, is around the language that we use. So, you know, our network is called our accessibility network because there were some kind of conversations around whether we should be saying disability. I personally think that we should be. We shouldn't stigmatize the term disability because that has an impact on those who identify as disabled. That's my personal opinion. But, you know, in terms of language, what would you kind of suggest here? I know that there's probably not just a one-word answer to that, but any insights on language and inclusivity around that would be great.
Thank you, Corinne. Chloe, we'll come to you first and then Ross.
Thank you. So I suppose I'm like coming at this question from like my employer's point of view at Scope, and my individual point of view. And I think I agree the word disability or disabled is not a bad word. But I think potentially the reasons why people might not want that is because, like what Beth said earlier, some people don't see themselves as disabled, even if they have a condition or impairment. So at Scope, we would say like a disabled person rather than a person with disabilities. Again, that is personal choice. But the reason why Scope and myself, I suppose, choose to do that is because we are disabled by society. If we have all the reasonable adjustments and things in place, we are left with our condition and impairment. And actually we are able to do the same things as everyone else. It might just look different. But I think in terms of language, it very much is an individual thing. And some people, the way they describe themselves might change over time. But yeah, I think that's like the most important thing, that actually asks the individual how they want to be described as, or like the language they would prefer to use about themselves.
Thank you, Chloe. Really important point that language is absolutely personal preference. So Ross, we'll come to you next, and then Beth.
Yeah, so yesterday actually at work, the day before, I was asked a very similar question. We were looking at some guidance around some wording, and they reached out to a couple of us that were wheelchair users and said, what is the preferred term like? And I think it is so individual. And it's a kind of a shame, really, that we have to even label stuff, isn't it? Really, that's the biggest problem, and there's no easy answer. I do think like kind of sometimes this like extra abilities or super abilities, I think that's a bit kind of condescending from a personal point of view. I just think keep it simple and don't complicate it. What it is, it is what it is. The word's been used for a long time. It's not a negative word. There are far worse things that have been used to describe me. I think the other thing as well, and again, speaking from personal experience, my disability is the least interesting part about me, and kind of so therefore, I don't necessarily think like I have a very different view. I'm just so chilled out about this sort of stuff. But yeah, my disability is only prevailing when there's a barrier. So I think if organisations spent a bit more time focusing on removing the barriers, we probably need to worry less about putting people in groups.
Thank you, Ross. That really resonates with me, and it's one of those things like I often forget when I'm doing virtual meetings like this. I often forget to tell people that I'm a wheelchair user, if that's relevant to the conversation, because prior to the world becoming virtual in this way, I have been used to that just being, the thing that people notice about me when they meet me. And so it's interesting, isn't it, about how we sort of choose to define ourselves as well, I suppose. Beth?
I think it's a really good question, and not that long ago I was discussing with someone who was deaf whether they like to be called hearing impaired. I say that I have a hearing impairment, or I have a hearing loss, or I have a hearing disability, and I don't really, I mean, as Ross said, I'm pretty chilled. I know that medically my doctors told me that I have a hearing loss. It just, for me, it just is what it is. But I suppose I think everyone's individual. If it's worth it, I think as a line manager, feel free to sort of ask that question, I think, of how would you prefer to be kind of referred to, or so on. Just ask, because I think it's much better to ask than for that person to say later, well, look, I don't really, I'm a bit offended by certain things that you've said. Interestingly, we at my company have set up a neurodiversity strand to our disability network, which brought up the question of terminology around, if we're going to have a neurodiversity strand, what do we call the other side of it? And we came eventually to describing it as physical and hidden disabilities and neurodiversity. And we have 2 board sponsors for them, albeit one network that covers both. But the way that the central team got to that is they actually reached out to our network via what used to be AMA, it's now called Viva Engage channel, to say, look, we're considering what we're going to call our networks. This is our idea. What do you think? And it just got lots of thumbs up. So it was kind of the voice of the network was the input was sought in terms of those ideas. But as I say, and someone said earlier, you're never going to get it right the first time. And actually, for me, we should be looking for ways that we can bond together and work together, and not, shoot each other down for using the wrong terminology. It's not the best place to start, is it? So, yeah, I think just being a bit accepting and asking the question would be key for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. That's super helpful. So I believe we have time for one more question. We are unfortunately running out of time, so we're down to 5 minutes. So we have first audience member with their hand up, and we have enabled your microphone, Pat, so you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's a very interesting session. I wanted to know if anyone can point me in the direction of any support for my employers. What I've put in the chat is that Access to Work have actually said they could provide funding for me to have an admin support worker, but my employer just doesn't seem at all to know how to go about this, and just raise all sorts of questions about how on earth can they set up a contract on this. So is there anybody who has experiences of these contracts that I could point my employers in the direction of, or have an example of how these are set up? Because certainly Access to Work don't have an issue with it. They've said it can happen, it has happened, but not in my particular trust. So yes, please, any advice out there?
Ross, I think you raised your hand first, and I know you have a huge amount of experience in this area, so we're going to come to you.
Yeah, thank you. So there's 3 options here for you. So your employers can advertise a job, a fixed term contract for a year to be renewed, or 3 years, because typically that's what Access to Work's funding's for. And then when it comes to paying that person, we've actually done this recently. The claim monies can go back to the organisation to fund that member of staff. So it's no different from them creating any other job. They just need to probably think about how they describe the job, and that it obviously is dependent on you remaining employed with that organisation. And as long as that employee is aware of that, then that should be cool. Second thing is they could go to an agency. And the agency could provide someone that then meets your employer's vetting requirements. And Access to Work, the agency can bill Access to Work, and many agencies, not that I'm doing any plug-in, but again, if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I could put you in touch with a couple of agencies that I know that provide support workers for people, and will bill Access to Work directly and manage your Access to Work budget. And the third one is you could employ someone yourself, and you could just get your work to, again, go through what it is they need to let that person support you, providing that person meets their requirements. And you could become an employer and pay the person yourself by claiming from Access to Work. I would say that is the more difficult way of doing it. I do that myself. It does require another job almost in life, but it does give you choice and preference of who and who and when supports you. So those are the 3 options. And if your organisation is not supporting it, they're not really being very inclusive.
Thank you, Ross. I am going to have to end our Q&A at this point and begin our sort of wrapping up. So I'd like to thank all of our participants for sharing their valuable thoughts and experiences today. Thank you to our audience for attending. We hope that this session has given you some insight into inclusive employment. We will be emailing everybody who attended today with a recording of the session. Feel free to share that within your networks, and a short feedback form. We'd be so grateful if you could please complete the feedback form, because it helps us to plan future webinars and ensure that we're covering the topics that you really want to know about. Going to leave this final slides with my contact details. If you have any queries that haven't been addressed, feel free to get in touch with me directly. If you have any queries for our panelists, I can also field those and pass them on to the panelists. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Great session. I've really enjoyed it. I hope that you have as well. And we will be back